listener production. Hello, welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sasha Barbagat. What's going to rank highly for you this federal election? The cost of living, housing? What about the environment?
I mean, there's no doubt it's going to be a crowded space. I mean, there's just so much that the government needs to be doing. But, the Australian public wants it. Polling shows that time and time again that there's a very strong expectation that our national government will be taking responsibility for environmental protection, improving environmental outcomes.
In the second half of this episode, we're asking if the environment will get much of a look in this federal election and whether voters will actually care about it when it comes to deciding who gets their vote. First, though, it's time for the headlines with Chris Spiru on Thursday, the 23rd of January.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. New polling has given Peter Dutton a significant lead over Anthony Albanese as preferred PM. The Resolve Political Monitor has the opposition leader sitting 5 points ahead of the Labor leader after they were tied at the end of last year. The reason? Well, it's frustrations over the cost of living, with half of voters expecting inflation to get worse and 46% expecting their real wages to fall this year. In what's being dubbed a rejection of Labor's promise that price pressures are easing, the coalition has maintained its lead over the government, 38 points compared to 27, Sash.
While overall support for the Greens has risen from 12 to 13%, Pauline Hanson's One Nation is unchanged at 7%. And interestingly, support for independence has slipped from 11 to 10. Now, pointing to the results, Resolve's director Jim Reid says Dutton and the coalition have cemented their leads on almost all policy questions put to voters about who would improve the country and do best for households. He also says Labor's attempts to paint Dutton as negative and nasty, while a justified point of attack, have not managed to win hesitant voters over. I just want to rewind back to the point about voters concerned about their real wages falling this year. I haven't seen that coming from any economists or any predictions of what's happening in 2025. So this could just be a hangover of how bad the cost of living crisis has been, that people are just inherently negative about it, which I totally understand. However, I kind of want to allay people's fears a little bit that that's not really what they're expecting to happen. Don't get me wrong. Wages aren't going up by astronomical amounts by any stretch of the imagination, but the idea that they're going to fall in 2025 is pretty unlikely. It's interesting as well, we talk about polling. We're going to hear so much about polling as we creep into the election campaign, and we see how different it can be. We did a story on Tuesday in the headlines about a Guardian poll that was talking about how voters are feeling more optimistic. This one's really negative. Remember, these are commissioned by certain newspapers or media companies that might have certain biases. So just keep that filter on when you're hearing these stories. It's not necessarily a full representation of what the Australian public is feeling.
And I think that's a lesson that we learned from the US election, right? There was so much polling that was showing it was going to be a neck-and-neck race, and then in the end, it turned out to not be the case. So, it is approach polls with caution, but I think there are lessons that can be learned. And I think overall, it's interesting what the director Jim Reid said, that point about villainising Peter Dutton. While it's somewhat true, it's not working. It's not swaying votes. People at the end of the day want action. And whether that action is someone who's taking a bit of a hard line, strongman approach, it's like people are like, okay, let's try something different. And I think that's generally true of governments that are in power during a period of economic downturn. Those are the governments that are getting criticised the most. And those are governments that generally are showing the door, come election time.
Which we've seen over the last couple of years as well, and even in our state elections too. Labor in Queensland got booted out for the Liberals after nearly a decade in power. There are other issues at play there, but there's no doubt that forms part of it. And people go, we need something to change. I'm going to change the government.
Over to the US now, where Donald Trump is continuing his flurry of actions, orders and announcements following his return to the White House. After missing his own deadline to end Russia's war on Ukraine on day one, he's posted to Truth Social warning Vladimir Putin the US will impose high levels of taxes, tariffs and sanctions if he doesn't pull out of the country. In the post, he wrote, "Let's get this war, which never would have started if I were president, over with. We can do it the easy way or the hard way, and the easy way is always better." Trump didn't specify what these penalties would look like, and it is worth saying the US is already imposing some pretty strict sanctions on Russia and has been since its 2022 invasion.
Yeah, one to watch. Also overnight, the president has demanded an apology of the bishop who directly addressed him at a post-inauguration prayer service. This was the final official event of the inauguration. So Trump was there, his whole family was there, there were cameras everywhere. Here's a little bit of what the bishop said if you missed it.
I ask you to have mercy, Mr. President, on those in our communities whose children fear that their parents will be taken away, and that you help those who are fleeing war zones and persecution in their own lands to find compassion and welcome here.
Trump stared her down for pretty much that entire plea. She mentioned gay, lesbian, transgender people who are frightened. Now posting once again to Truth, Trump has called Bishop Budd a radical left hardline Trump hater, claiming she brought her church into the world of politics in a very ungracious way. She was nasty in tone and not compelling or smart, bringing back that nasty criticism of women, which he has done quite a bit in the past. Now, her words about mercy for immigrants and refugees is now holding significant meaning. So we've got news that one of the executive orders that Trump signed on Inauguration Day has left refugees that were cleared to enter the United States stranded. AP is reporting thousands of refugees are now stuck at various locations around the globe after an order suspended refugee arrivals into the country until further notice. And the body that oversees these refugee arrivals has confirmed that this is the order, and until further notice, no refugees will be allowed into the United States. So we knew that this was a major platform for Trump coming into his second presidency. He's talked so many times about the border and Mexican immigrants. He's talked about refugees. He has talked about this mass deportation. So the sentiment in America is that half of US adults, according to a recent survey by Associated Press, think that increasing security at the border should be a high priority for the federal government, and only 2 in 10 consider it a low priority. So while it might sound like quite a shocking hardline approach, it does seem that for the majority of Americans, or at least half of Americans, it's a priority. They think it's important. So while it's confronting to see and to hear about, Trump has the mandate to do this. He thinks he has the mandate to do this because he campaigned on it, he was elected on it, and now he's carrying it out as president.
Back home now, we were warned it would happen, and now there's official confirmation that we are paying more for flights since the collapse of Rex and Bonza. The cost of flying the Sydney to Melbourne route, one of the busiest in the world, has now jumped by 42%, according to Webjet. The average price of a return ticket currently sitting at $550 compared to $385 when Rex was offering services on the route.
While the Bureau of Infrastructure and Transport Research Economics says the cheapest available flight between the two cities increased by 47% at the end of 2024. And it's not just Sydney to Melbourne either. The average Sydney to Brisbane airfare is now 67.9% more expensive than it was in October. But the Melbourne to Brisbane route has remained steady. There is some good news overall for domestic flights, however, because the average price per passenger has fallen almost 20% over the past 2 months. But the Sydney to Melbourne route is the busiest and among the busiest in the world. So that's lots of people paying more for their flights.
And ending today in some more kind of bad news, there are no more Aussies left in singles action at the Australian Open, with Alex de Minaur going down to world number 1 and defending champ Yannick Sinner in their quarterfinal clash last night.
Obviously, the whole country wanted me to do well. I wanted to do well here. I would have loved to do more today. But this is what happens sometimes in tennis.
Yeah, he did the post-match interview. He was so somber and sad and disappointed in himself. But honestly, yesterday's match was a first for him. He's 25 years old and this is the only time he's reached and played a quarterfinal at the AO. He's taking on world number 1 and a defending champ. Honestly, it's an awesome effort. Congratulations to him. No need to be ashamed. We are very proud of you.
Very proud, but while we say that there are no Aussies, which is disappointing, there are still plenty of stars left as we get into the semis. We're at the pointy end now of the competition. Tonight, it's the women with defending champ Aryna Sabalenka up against Paula Badoza, while Madison Keys plays Iga Swiatek. The men take to the court on Friday night for their semi-finals with Novak Djokovic playing Alexander Zverev and Yannick Sinner, taking on Ben Shelton. Nah, he's all right. But he knocked out our demon. I'm upset. But there's one more ray of hope. Although we're guaranteed a win in this. We're guaranteed a win
Truly we are.
in the mixed doubles final because it's the first all-Aussie one since 1967. It happens tomorrow. We've got Kimberly Birrell and John Patrick Smith taking on Olivia Gadecki and John Peers. So they can let our Aussie flag fly.
Absolutely.
At the AO. Chris, thank you. Next up, we're getting into a deep dive asking, is the environment going to get a look in at the 2025 federal election? Cast your mind back to 2022. It's a federal election campaign with the Labor Party desperately trying to wrangle the leadership from the Liberals after 10 long years in the political wilderness. Part of the then opposition's pitch to the Australian public was the promise of finally getting some action on climate change. The ABC's Vote Compass at the time ranked it as the number one issue for a majority of voters in the days before the worst of the cost of living crisis. Labor promised to end the climate wars, stop animal extinctions and establish a federal EPA after what was perceived as years of inaction by the Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison governments. While in the wings was an army of teal independents, MPs who prioritised climate action and promised to be a point of difference to the major parties. Labor and a number of teal swept to power that year in what was seen in part as a sharp rebuke of the coalition's approach to the environment. Now, fast forward 3 years and the priorities of Australians have changed. The cost of living has hit hard and is at the front of most people's minds as we head into the 2025 election campaign. That's shaping up to be the focus of the major parties as they try to win our votes. While Anthony Albanese and Labor have failed to deliver on a number of their key climate promises, and with the coalition not known for its strong stance on protecting the environment, can we expect it to get much of a look in this election? The Australian Conservation Foundation is pressuring the Albanese government to make good on one of its pledges to set up an independent EPA before we head to the polls. And Brendan Sides is the ACF's National Biodiversity Policy Advisor. Brendan, welcome. Let's start with a report card of the Albanese government. How would you score Labor's record on the environment over the last 3 years?
I don't think I'll hazard trying to put a number on it, but in terms of the narrative, they really haven't met our hopes and expectations, I would say. I mean, there's some early promise and some good signs of some good commitments, and there's been a few good things too. I'm happy to come to those. But overall, on the sort of stuff that's really important to us, which is moving the dial on fixing our broken national nature protection laws particularly, they've made some good promises, but they haven't delivered.
What key environmental promises do you think were missed that should have been hit in Labor's first and perhaps only term in government?
Some of the really important promises that the then Albanese opposition made prior to the last election were around reforming our national environment protection laws. There was a review done under the previous government. It was pretty damning in terms of its findings on the failures of those laws and made some extensive recommendations for reform, which the previous government, the Morrison government, didn't really action. So we were really pleased to see that the government said, we'll do it, we'll respond to those laws. And indeed, they added to that a commitment to a new National Environment Protection Authority. So they're really important promises. And we've been disappointed, I guess, that they haven't as yet delivered on those promises.
What do you think Labor got right?
So there's been some good things. First of all, in relation to those promises, the first and initial step there was to actually map out the detail of what those reforms would look like, how and when they would be delivered. And in December 2022, the Environment Minister, Tanya Plibersek, having got around the portfolio pretty quickly, made a significant announcement, released a significant paper, the Nature Positive Plan, setting out the program for reform and committing to actually getting legislation into Parliament by the end of 2023. So that was good, and we welcomed that at the time. We've worked since to actually try and ensure that those reforms are delivered and so forth. As I said, they haven't been, but the promise, the detail that was set out in that plan was good. At about the same time, in December 2022, the government signed Australia up to what's called the Global Biodiversity Framework, a new international agreement that countries around the world have agreed to halt and reverse biodiversity decline by 2030. So once again, really good, some good international leadership. There's been a couple of other things as well. I mean, the administration of threatened species legislation, for instance, under the previous government was pretty woeful, and just administratively the government has turned those things around and improved things to a degree, so credit where it's due there. There's been some good decisions. There was a decision made by the Environment Minister to refuse the Walker Corp's proposed development in the Toondah Harbour in Queensland. There was a process that should never have got out of the blocks but got underway under Josh Frydenberg when he was Environment Minister, and the Minister, when it finally came to a final decision there, made the right decision and said no to that She said no to a new coal mine from Clive Palmer as well, so clearly she can say no to those things. She hasn't done so since, but she demonstrated that it's possible. There's some other things as well that the government should get credit for, marine park announcements, some funding initiatives and so forth.
Look, we've seen something that the Australian Conservation Foundation is pushing for is the establishment of a federal EPA. It's worth noting that's something that Labor had pledged to do in the lead up to the 2022 election. What is the point of having a national body when the states already have their EPAs? Why do we have to have a federal approach to it?
You're absolutely right. The government did commit to that. It's a really important one. It's really about improving the effectiveness and the accountability for the administration of our national environmental laws. We've had national environmental laws in Australia since at least the 70s. The Commonwealth, our national government, has a really important role to play when it comes to environmental law and environmental protection. They're responsible for our international commitments. They respond to and have responded to public expectations that there's national leadership on these issues. Biodiversity, nature, wildlife, it doesn't respect state boundaries and borders, obviously, as well. So there's a clear role for the national government. But that clear role at the moment is reflected in laws, but not in the way that those laws are administered. They're basically just administered by the department. So a game changer, we think, would be to take it out of the hands of the department and put it into the hands of an independent, accountable and professional regulator, a national EPA. So it's not about duplicating state and territory responsibilities or taking things over from them. It's about actually getting a good national environmental regulator in place that would form part of an integrated system of national environmental protection that sees both the Commonwealth government and state and territory governments doing everything that's necessary to actually protect nature.
Look, I want to turn to looking forward now. You know, we saw in the 2022 election campaign, Labor was very strong on trying to sell itself as the alternative to the coalition when it came to the environment, when it came to climate, you know, ending the 10 years of inaction, essentially. But people's priorities have shifted so much. Can we expect such a strong environmental promise from Labor at this year's election, especially as well, given that it's failed to achieve a bunch of its 2022 pledges?
I mean, there's no doubt it's going to be a crowded space. I mean, there's just so much that the government needs to be doing. And we've got climate-related action really high on our list as well as obviously nature protection and other things. And then, cost of living, a whole range of other things as well. But, the Australian public wants it. Polling shows that time and time again that there's a very strong expectation that our national government will be taking responsibility for environmental protection and improving environmental outcomes. There's a lot of unfinished business from this parliament, I guess, is the other way to look at it as well, and we'll be pushing very strongly to say, well, those promises were promises that were really important back prior to the last election. They're equally important, if not more important now, given the continued delays and the continued decline in biodiversity in this country. So we'll be pushing strongly for a continuation of those commitments and finishing off the unfinished business, I guess, from this term of parliament.
Do you think, though, that people care as much this year in 2025? Now, the importance of these things isn't in dispute, but in terms of what is popular policy, what is going to win votes, the average person right now cares about putting food on the table, paying their mortgage, being able to go to a doctor or get into a hospital when they need to. Do you think that the environment is going to rank as a popular policy platform for Labor or the coalition, given the cost of living crisis and how much that has changed people's priorities over the last 3 years?
I guess time will tell. As I said before, it's definitely a crowded space. As you've correctly pointed out, there are priorities, and priorities have moved over the last 3 years as well. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Once again, though, I think long-standing support for strong national leadership on environmental protection. Australians love their wildlife and natural places. They want to see the bush protected. When people know the facts around the sort of amount of deforestation, how much of the bush we're bulldozing in Australia still, they're horrified. So I think maybe it boils down to some sort of key contests as well, where there's strong voices in key seats around some of these sorts of things. I think it still will be an important part of the mix. But, there's no doubt that organisations like us, ACF, have got their work cut out to actually make sure that it gets the priority that it deserves.
Have you got any indication at this stage from the coalition as to what it's going to be promising in this space?
No. We look forward to working with them and seeing what they're actually prepared to commit to. We have set out our priorities and documented them clearly, and we're wanting to engage with all sides of politics on where they stand on those issues. And we want to communicate then to the Australian public who be able to exercise critical votes around these sorts of issues. I'd have to say that I guess that signs at the moment aren't that promising in the sense that some of the things that the Albanese government has committed to, but as I said, failed to deliver, but committed to nonetheless, the opposition haven't played a very constructive role in relation to those, so we'll wait and see. But, there's hope. The Howard government originally was responsible for the current set of national environmental laws we have in place. There's been good initiatives under previous coalition governments, so there's room for a constructive role. We'll keep an open mind and, continue to engage with them and push them and see what we can get.
What about Peter Dutton's nuclear plans? Is there concern around those?
Oh, absolutely. Australia's future is renewable, not radioactive. It's just a really terrible distraction from the really urgent task of hastening Australia's energy transition from dirty, polluting fossil fuels to a clean, renewable future. It's expensive, it's dangerous, there's no clear plans in place to deal with the waste. It's just a really bad policy and something we're deeply concerned about, yes.
Look, to be realistic, there's a lot that is going to be on the priority list for both major parties, and they have responsibilities to different stakeholders, whether it's communities or businesses, mining, we've seen that. The environment and those issues are going to sometimes take a back seat to bigger policies of national importance. But in your opinion, I'd love to hear, the three things that you think are non-negotiables over whoever is elected, whether it's Labor, the coalition, or we have a minority government. What are the top three issues we can't be ignoring as we head into the next 3 years?
ACF priorities generally, I guess there's a range of things across climate, particularly, continuing our journey towards renewables and off fossil fuels. It's obviously a huge priority. In the area that I lead on, nature protection, the unfinished business of the overhaul of our nature protection laws is a really high priority. It's just untenable that we've got a situation where everyone agrees that the legislation doesn't work, it's not protecting nature, things are going backwards, and we seem to be hamstrung largely because of the influence of vested interests, hamstrung in terms of getting those improvements in place. So that just absolutely needs to be done. And then funding. I mean, the funding for the environment from our national government is woeful, and people are always surprised when they just see how low it is relative to other areas of spending and other ways in which their tax dollars are committed by the government. So some really significant improvements on that, getting in place some good long-term programmatic funding that's really essential to actually not just protecting nature, but turning around the legacy of decline that we have here in Australia and getting us onto a restoration trajectory.
Brendan, thank you so much for joining us today. Much appreciated.
Thank you. Thanks for your interest.
That was Brendan Sides from the Australian Conservation Foundation speaking with me there. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That is it for now. Before you go, we would love it if you could share this ep with someone you think might enjoy it. It is a really easy way you can support us and all that we do here at The Briefing. And so is sharing our socials posts. You can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and on YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. I'm Sasha Barbagat. See you next time.